Xi Jinping visited 3 European countries, France, Serbia, and Hungary. He left behind many stories, too many to cover in one program. Now, regarding his visit to France, there are 2 very popular video clips circulating widely on the internet. One of these clips shows Xi Jinping shaking a bag again. In northern dialect, it's called shaking the bag, while in southern dialect, it's called showing the book list. This time, it's not just showing the book list. He even took out actual books. In the video, Macron's expression seems somewhat curious, but also bewildered. His wife also appears somewhat puzzled. On the other hand, Peng looks as if she has a more extraordinary expression than others, as if her husband is quite remarkable. Xi Jinping gave France a batch of books by French writers, but they were translated into Chinese. This is because Xi Jinping said many years ago, when he was a sent-down youth in Liangjiahe, Yan'an, he read many books. Then, when he went abroad for visits, he shook the bag and recited a long list of book titles. It sounds like he's incredibly knowledgeable and talented. Isn't it very attractive? Actually, people of Xi Jinping's generation might shake their heads wryly or even sneer when they hear this. Why? Because this was the typical situation for the educated youth generation. At that time, whether in Beijing or in smaller cities, with a wave of Mao Zedong's hand, it was decided that educated youth should go to the countryside, which was considered a vast land. The Cultural Revolution swept them into the countryside. After arriving in the countryside, there were fields everywhere, and hardly any schools or libraries. As long as there was one book, everyone would pass it around to read. At that time, there were hardly any TVs, and movies were scarce. All day long, it was the high-pitched loudspeakers in the countryside making a cacophony of noise. There was nothing else except for Chairman Mao's writings. So, any foreign books translated before the Communist Party came to power would spread as long as there was one copy, whether it was Russian, French, or British. Whether it was the works of Dickens from Britain, Hugo from France, or Tolstoy from Russia, anything would be passed around. Regardless of how many characters one knew, they could pass it on, and one book would be worn out from being read so much. So, most of the educated youth sent down to the countryside would read these kinds of books, like the works of Dumas and Alexandre Dumas, or Flaubert's Madame Bovary, or Hugo's 93. There were particularly many Russian works. Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, Resurrection. These were familiar to that generation of Chinese. Xi Jinping was born in the 1950s, not to mention that people from his era are familiar with these books. Even people from a generation later, born in the 1960s like me, are familiar with these books. Even most of the books he mentioned, I've read them, all passed around during that era. Although I wasn't an educated youth at the time, during the Cultural Revolution, I was just a child. But I started reading early, because there was nothing else to do. You had to read those things. So, I'm very familiar with this aspect. As long as they exist, as long as these foreign translated works haven't disappeared. However, most of those books were not translated during the era of the Communist Party. They were translated before the era of the Communist Party, just like the Fu Lei couple in Shanghai, who later committed suicide during the Cultural Revolution. They believed they didn't belong to that era. They translated a large number of books, and most of the French books were translated by them. Books by Romain Rolland were translated by him, and even earlier works, Russian works had many translations during the Republic of China era. Most Russian works were written by authors before the Soviet Communist Party came to power. Authors like Chekhov, Tolstoy, Turgenev, Pushkin, and so on. These literary giants were as numerous as the stars in the sky. That was during the Tsarist Russia era, during the era when the Soviet Communist Party seized power. After the Communist Party seized power, there were only 2 authors. One was Gorky, and the other was Sholokhov. Gorky initially had a good relationship with Lenin and praised Lenin. Gorky's works are even in Chinese communist textbooks. Like what Hua Chunying said, "Let the storm come more violently," is from Gorky's The Storm Petrel. Later, Stalin wanted Gorky to sing his praises, but Gorky refused and went into exile in Finland. Then there was only Sholokhov left, who wrote Quiet Flows the Dawn and won the Nobel Prize in Literature in the 1960s. So, these things are not surprising at all. People of that generation in China are very familiar with them. Even those with only elementary education can read those books. So Xi Jinping takes out his book list to show that he has read a lot of books, or that he has a great interest in French literature and so on. In fact, I'll just say, first, he doesn't represent himself, but represents the entire educated youth generation, the generation of the Cultural Revolution. Secondly, this is actually a tragedy, because during the Cultural Revolution there were hardly any books to read, and the only ones you could read were these foreign classics, and they were incomplete and fragmented. Another point is, even if you read these French books, you didn't grasp their essence. Most of these French works extol freedom of thought and civil rights, all yearning for freedom, yearning for civil rights. You read them for ages, but end up becoming a dictator, or even a great dictator. What's being repeated are the old paths of Stalin and Mao Zedong. So reading these books is futile. Boasting about them doesn't really mean anything. For example, if the French president were to visit China and give a batch of Chinese books translated into French, it would depend on whether the CCP accepts them or not. I would translate a batch of books from the Cultural Revolution era, translate some of China's scar literature, works banned by the CCP, or works that have real influence in China, translated into French, and give them to him. Xi Jinping probably wouldn't even dare to accept the gift without first checking if the book was published by the Communist Party, whether it was written by a Communist Party writer and then translated into French. So this is very absurd, but it's unclear why Xi Jinping would take such delight in it. Some say it's because the people around him have deceived him. Xi Jinping shaking his book list was originally an unsavory rumor outside. It was a scandal, because he repeatedly mispronounced words but claimed to have read many books. Many people outside were spreading it, but Xi Jinping didn't know, and the people around him didn't dare to tell him. They say he's showing off his book list outside, shaking his bag. They dare not tell him, and he thinks it's his own gag, or his own specialty to show off. So this time when he went to France, he showed off again.